The Punisher is a killer haunted by the loss of his family and driven by a quest for vengeance. His way of dealing with crime is very simple. Hunt down those who do wrong and make them pay. Yet, throughout the first 2 seasons of the show, there are some moments that might surprise you. Moments where Frank chooses not to kill, but actually spare his adversaries. Let's dive into each of these and explore why Frank held back and understand what this says about his moral code. Our story begins with David Lieberman, also known as Micro. When Frank first encounters Micro, he's cautious and suspicious of him. Rightly so. Micro knows things about Frank that no one or only a handful of people know. Details about his past, his family, and even his present whereabouts. At this point, Frank is solely focused on laying low under his new identity, Pete Castiglione. But at this point in the story, the world thinks Frank Castle is dead. Micro poses a threat between his old life and his new one. In episode 2 of season 1, Frank is shaken up by the fact that someone knows he's alive. So he goes to the 2 people that do know he's alive, Curtis and Karen, to investigate if they've ever spilled or accidentally have any loose ties they have told about Frank still being alive. He specifically asks Karen, a reporter, to investigate Micro. Karen is really reluctant, stating,
I want to help you, but not if it's going to get someone killed.
Karen eventually gives up information on Micro's family, causing him to infiltrate and investigate their house. Micro and Castle eventually arrange a meet at a graveyard, but Castle deceives Micro into not even turning up.
Castle!
Instead, having him in his sights. Getting Curtis to meet up with Micro gets David to back off, giving Castle the opportunity to track Micro back to his hideout. I personally think that he hid in Micro's boot instead of following him via car, because Micro is extra careful and who would check their own trunk. Frank tracks Micro, knocks him out and straps him to a chair, fully prepared to end his life, torturing him, basically saying that his life is over. But something makes Frank hesitate. Micro doesn't fight back. Instead, he reaches out. He's been waiting to talk to Frank. He tells Frank that they're after the same thing. He's after the same people who wronged Frank. And instead of seeing an enemy, Frank sees an opportunity. Well, at first he doesn't see an opportunity. He resents it at first. The last nail in the coffin is the fact that his Operation Cerberus did not exist. The operation funded by the CIA that made Frank murderer of innocent men in Afghanistan to smuggle heroin. It's not exactly a moral decision, but Frank's choice to spare Micro is one of practicality and marks the beginning of their partnership in which their goals align. And then we have Lewis Wilson, a young veteran struggling with the returning from his time in active combat and active duty. Frank sees a lot of himself in Lewis, someone broken by the system, abandoned by the very people who are supposed to help him. At first, Frank's interactions with Lewis are out of concern for his wellness. He tries to guide him even though he sets off a bunch of bombs on innocent civilians in the city. Lewis even beats up Curtis, a disabled veteran who's even trying to help Lewis's recovery. As Lewis becomes more radicalized by strapping claymores to Curtis, Frank realizes that the situation has escalated beyond his control. In episode 9, Frank finally confronts Lewis in a tense call between them, stating that he has a United States Marine hostage.
You got a United States Marine here! A United States Marine!
Really asking Lewis if he's ready to kill him and Curtis. Frank was staring at him in the eyes. He could have taken the shot this time, but he didn't. He needed to fish more information out of him to defuse the bomb. In a final altercation, a hostage situation in episode 10, Frank tries to defuse the situation by talking to Lewis, trying to connect to his views and morals, even though it ends in Lewis's death. Frank doesn't kill him. Lewis does it himself by trapping himself in the freezer room. Frank tries to get in and open the door but can't. Right before Lewis ends himself, Castle says the words,
That's good. You can do it like a soldier.
Now it's not clear what he meant by this. Did he think that Lewis was de-escalated and calming down? Or was he egging him on to end himself? What does this mean for Castle's morals? Lewis was just like Castle. Does he know that this was the best and only way that he would have given him peace? And was this technically a mercy killing? Frank decides not to kill any US Marine at the US military base, as he knows that the people in power and the higher-ups like Schoonover are the bad guys, who are taking advantage of them. Frank, so conflicted as he used to be a Marine himself, even asked the question of what shall I do if someone tries to stop him. Just as he was making his escape, he came in contact with a young, unnamed Marine in a long tunnel. Conflicted, holding himself back, and frustrated, tells the soldier to go easy and shoots him, only wounding him.
Easy. Easy. Easy.
But still affecting him.
It's a lot easier when you can kill people.
Making him angrier with his superiors even more. And if you want to see more videos like these, Subscribe. Now a really controversial one. Billy Russo in season 1. Frank literally destroys his face, leaving it mangled so he won't be seen as a pretty boy anymore. The reason for this is pretty clear. Billy, Castle's best friend, was behind the death of his family. Who wouldn't want some devastating revenge? But why didn't he kill him there and then? Well, there are multiple reasons. 1. He was unconscious and wasn't a threat, so he thought he could come back and deal with him later, after he had unrestrained the hostages and tended to Madani, who was shot in the head, mind you. Between that and the police arriving, he wasn't gonna execute someone in front of the police with an injured detective on the scene. Frank's smarter than that. Reason 2. Frank thought he killed him, but didn't. Reason 3 might have been that he wanted Billy to live with the brain damage and the scars of what he has done. But we all know this wasn't the case because of the writer's decision to kill him off in season 2, where he appeared as Jigsaw. Season 2 brings us to John Pilgrim, a complex character with his own twisted sense of duty. Pilgrim is sent to hunt Frank down, and their paths inevitably lead to a brutal 1v1 between them. Pilgrim is relentless, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it takes to complete his mission. But when Frank finally has him on the ground, broken and unable to fight back, he decides to spare him. Instead, Frank pauses and sees something in Pilgrim which resonates with him. Being a father for his children and being used by someone powerful, just as Frank once was. Frank understands that Pilgrim's motivations are rooted in his love for his family. Funnily enough, this reminded me of the Martha scene from the old DCEU in Batman v Superman. It's an act of mercy that surprises even Pilgrim. Frank lets him go, telling him to go back to his sons. It's a rare moment where Frank chooses empathy over vengeance. He sees himself in him, and he acknowledges that not every enemy deserves death. Throughout season 2, Frank becomes a guardian for Amy's hunters, a young girl caught in a deadly conspiracy. Frank, being true to his nature, takes it upon himself to protect her. There are multiple times where Frank confronts these hired guns, and it'll be easier for him to kill them. They're a threat, they're in his way, and they're trying to harm someone under his protection. In episode 5, for example, Frank subdues a group of mercenaries in a gym. They're incapacitated at his mercy, and you can almost see the moment where Frank considers finishing them off. But he doesn't. These men aren't evil, they're just following orders. They aren't the masterminds behind the conspiracy, they're tools, not true villains. Frank decides to let them go, to spare their lives. It's a calculated decision that also shows that Frank's sense of justice isn't black and white, as it might seem. He doesn't kill them without reason, and if a target doesn't meet his criteria, he'll hold back. It's interesting though. What's the difference between sparing these goons and the goons that worked for William Rawlins, the main villain in season 1? These moments of restraint are significant because they reveal the layers between Frank Castle's hard exterior. To many people, he's just a killer, a man out for revenge, and a ruthless judge, jury, and executioner, with no regard for the consequences. But these acts of mercy show us that Frank's code is more complex than simple vengeance. He ain't a mindless killer, he's a man who makes choices about who deserves to die and who might deserve another chance. Who's a piece of shit and who's not. In sparing Micro, Frank saw a potential ally. In trying to save Lewis, he saw someone he could have been, himself. A reminder of how close he came to losing himself. With John, Frank saw a father, a man fighting to protect his children, and in that, a piece of himself again. And with Amy's pursuers, he recognized that they weren't the true enemy. They were just cogs in a much bigger machine. And with Bill, well, that's a bit more inconclusive. So what do you think these moments tell us about Frank Castle? And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe.